So, when we talk about food loss and waste being a significant issue, I want to get into some of the details about why it's such an important topic. So, food loss and waste, the scale of the challenge. About 1/3 of all food is lost or wasted each year, according to FAO estimates. And that food loss and waste costs the global economy $940 billion each year. And 8% of annual greenhouse gas emissions can be attributed to food loss and waste. And so what you'll see here is that that means that if food loss and waste were its own country, it would be the world's third largest greenhouse gas emitter. Another way of looking at this is in terms of the fact that it amounts to about 1 billion tons of food that gets thrown away each year, while 1 in 9 people globally remain malnourished. And in this current time with the COVID crisis, we've only seen food loss and waste become more prominent in the news. You've probably seen some of the stories about how food has had to go to waste due to failures in supply chains or closed markets or closed restaurants. So it really emphasizes the fact that this is an issue that was already important to address and is now even more so. Looking at how food loss and waste shows up throughout the supply chain, in areas like North America, Europe, and industrialized Asia, you can see that in that pinkish reddish bars, that's the consumption side, it's much more significant at the consumer level. Whereas if you look at the greenish bars, those are for production and handling and storage. There's a lot more loss and waste happening in regions like Latin America, South and Southeast Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa in that production side of the supply chain. So even though the end result is the same, that food that was intended for humans is not eaten, the ways that shows up in the value chain is very different depending on what part of the world you're in. Just going through a few more basic sort of background facts, the types of foods that get lost and wasted. By weight, it's fruits and vegetables primarily due to the high water content of those. If you look at it in different metrics, if you looked at it in terms of calories, for example, cereals would show up as a much larger proportion due to the high caloric content of cereals. And then even though things like meat and milk have a small percentage compared to other commodities, they are significant in terms of environmental impacts like greenhouse gas emissions. So this can really vary depending on what your metric is. So why should you seek to reduce food loss and waste within your operations? Well, here's that target again that I mentioned earlier, the Sustainable Development Goal target 12.3. So in case you're not familiar, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted by the United Nations in 2015. And there are a number of goals that aim to secure sustainable development for the future. Specifically, 12.3, the one that we're most interested in for these purposes, aims to have per capita global food loss and waste by 2030. And so what are the benefits of doing this? Why do we even care? Well, socially, it's about improving food security for a growing population. And if you're able to redistribute some of that food waste to food banks and other redistribution services, you can feed hungry people with it. In terms of environmental impacts, I've already gone over this somewhat, but it helps to conserve and protect natural resources by reducing food loss and waste, and it also contributes to reducing climate change. And then finally, the economic argument is quite strong. And it's about increasing efficiency, avoiding unnecessary costs, and in some cases even generating new revenue sources when something that was previously a waste product can be repurposed into something with value. So digging a little deeper on the economic side, in 2017, we actually quantified the business case for companies across a wide range of companies in 17 countries, as you can see here. And 99% of the sites that we looked at had a positive return on their investment and yielded a 14-to-1 return on their interventions. So this isn't just about doing good for the planet or for people, but it makes just good business sense. And a lot of companies who initially think that they're not wasting anything in their operations find that there are some simple interventions they can make that have these big returns. So just jumping into the way that most companies tend to address food loss and waste, this is just a quick overview of that. It's the target, measure, act approach. And so what this means is you set a target, adopting 12.3 in your country or company, you measure and share those results publicly, and then you take action. So why have we honed in on these 3 steps? Well, first, with targets. Targets set ambition, and ambition motivates action. What we mean by this is that you can set a target before you know exactly how you're going to get there. And a 50% target is very ambitious and sounds very challenging, and it can be. But there are companies that have begun, that started by setting a target and have already reached a 30, 40% reduction in just a matter of a few years. So it's not it's daunting, but it's achievable. Measurement, what gets measured gets managed. That's a saying coined by this fellow here, Peter Drucker, a famous business consultant. Why do we focus in on measurement? Well, it's because measurement really helps you to understand the landscape of what you're facing. So you can understand the size of the opportunity when you know what's being lost and wasted and in what extents. You can identify the hot spots and prioritize. So if you discover that in your manufacturing facilities, it's really tomatoes that are being wasted to a huge amount, then you can start looking at, okay, what are we doing with tomatoes specifically that are leading to these high levels of waste? And then you track progress over time. So if you jump right to action without doing measurement, you're not actually sure if what you're doing is successful. So that's the really important part in terms of measurement, tracking progress over time. And just to show you that this is how many companies are doing this, these are all companies pictured here. They might even include some of yours that are setting targets and measuring. And so the thing that's really inspiring to me is that this isn't even exhaustive. We have to say not exhaustive because there are more that we couldn't fit on the slide. And so that's what's exciting to me personally, is that this is a really huge and growing movement towards taking this approach. Then finally, what ultimately matters is action. And action is going to look very different for different businesses. So in some cases, it might be addressing a training issue where employees are not packaging food properly or preparing it properly. It might be a matter of tweaking equipment or something like that, where it's a mechanical issue. So that's again why measurement is important, so that you can understand what the causes of action are. But then once you know that information, you implement those actions and you start making that difference and hopefully realizing the benefits. So I'm about to jump into what the 10 by 20 by 30 initiative is specifically, but I will pause here just to see if there are any questions about any of that background info that's just about food loss and waste generally.
Ryan, this is Ron Vennegiese from Highliner Foods. The one question I would have, this is great information. Will you be able to share this presentation with us?
Yes, I will. Thank you for asking. We will be posting the webinar recording and also the slides.
Beautiful, thank you.
No, thank you for reminding me to mention that. Okay, I'll just keep moving along since I'm not seeing anything, but again, please make sure to put any questions you have in the chat as we're going along, and we can address those at a Q&A stopping point. Okay, so about 10 by 20 by 30, why we're all here today. The 10 by 20 by 30 initiative, the goal is to massively increase private sector contribution to that SDG target 12.3 to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by 2030 by catalyzing efforts up the supply chain. So what that means is that at least 10 of the world's largest food retailers, seen there on the right side of the slide, and their providers follow the Target Measure Act approach and engage 20 of their priority suppliers to do the same. So 10 of the world's largest food retailers and providers engage 20 of their priority suppliers to do the same, thereby halving their food loss and waste by 2030. This is actually modeled on a relationship that Tesco had with their own suppliers, which I'll show a little bit about in the next slide. Those of you who are counting the companies on the right, you're seeing that there are 12. That's because we initially had 10 and 2 more joined in right as we were starting the initiative. So the more the merrier, the bigger the impact. It just sounds better to say 10 by 20 by 30 than 12 by 20 by 30. So why is this important? Well, it scales that Target Measure Act approach from just the companies on the right to 200 or even more. It catalyzes that whole chain approach, so making sure that we're addressing food loss and waste throughout the entire human food supply chain. And it involves 6 of the world's 10 largest food retailers, the world's 2nd largest food service providers, an iconic restaurant, and major regional players as well. And so who is involved? You've seen those on the right. Also folks from WRI, where I'm from, WRAP, which is a UK-based food, not just food waste, but they do lots of work on food waste organization, and the UN Environment Program. And so this approach has already been implemented by Tesco starting in 2017 with their suppliers seen here. And I know at least one of you is on the call. I saw someone from Gomez has joined us today. And so this is something that's worked with Tesco and their suppliers, where they engaged all these suppliers to start addressing food loss and waste within their operations and reporting that publicly. And we've already seen some really big results, and my colleague Kai will be going over a couple of those examples later in the presentation. So here's what the ask is for people who are involved in 10 by 20 by 30. So for Target, we ask that you adopt 12.3 for your own company and aim for a 50% reduction by 2030. For Measure, we ask you to measure the base year and the progress thereafter and share those results. And then ultimately, we ask you to take action to reduce the food loss and waste. And as I said, that can take a number of forms depending on what's actually happening within your operations. Now, of course, we're not going to ask that without making a significant offer of assistance and benefits for you. So what's that offer? The first is structured training seminars, where we'll be doing these webinars about every 2 to 3 months that each cover a different topic. We'll have online office hours where you can come ask us questions. And if we reach a point where it is safe again to have in-person group convenings, then we may have some of those as well. We'll provide guidance on a number of topics. These are just some of them. There'll be much more. But things like covering the business case, how to get started, how to set your measurement scope, and how to go about measuring. We'll provide strategies and tactics for reducing food loss and waste based on what's actually worked for people who have already come close to that 50% reduction. And you'll have access to food loss and waste reduction experts from WRI, WRAP, and others. The thing that I think is most important is that you'll also hear from practitioners from peer companies. So you won't just have us talking at you, but you'll be learning from those within your sectors that have already done this and learn from what's worked well for them and what the benefits have been. And also there'll be written case examples that will provide a similar function. And then you'll reap the benefits of reducing food loss and waste within your own operations and meeting corporate goals. So in a lot of ways, this can contribute to existing corporate goals around obviously economic and financial benefits, social good, environmental benefits, and the good public and media profile that comes from committing to something like this. So all of this collectively adds up to that overarching benefit of not having to go the journey alone, that you're doing it with 200 other companies. So just to give you an overview of what the training modules will be, the first one, which we're doing right now, is the Getting Started and Setting Your Scope. We're hosting this over the next, this month and the next. Next is the quantification methods and examples for measurement, which will be starting in September. Then in November, we'll dig into some of the questions you have as you've started to look into measurement within your own operations. Next, we'll have developing food loss and waste reduction strategies. So a lot of case examples on Okay, so we've done our measurement. Where do we go from there? Finally, a webinar on assessing progress and refining those strategies that you've developed based on the results. And so then the last item here is also that we might have some sector-specific trainings based on feedback that we receive. So for example, if the dairy sector, turns out there are a lot of companies from the dairy sector that could benefit from a dairy-focused gathering, we'll be happy to convene that sort of thing. And also we've had some companies who are already further along on their food loss and waste journey. Could we make sure that we have our microphones muted, please? Thank you. So for companies that are already further along on their food loss and waste journey, that there might be an advanced track where they can dig into some of the really deep issues that they're facing that might not be covered by this more starter approach. So some of the other guidance and assistance, again, those office hours that I mentioned, you can ask us questions for a response within, we'll aim for 48 hours. And you can contact me or my colleague Kai, who will be presenting a little later on, with any questions or requests that you have. And so the first big output from the initiative is going to be a September announcement of the participants. And so the Champions 12.3 group that I mentioned earlier, they hold an annual event during the UN General Assembly Week in late September, due to the link with the Sustainable Development Goals. And at that event this year on September 24th, which is going to be held virtually, we're going to announce all of the participants in 10 by 20 by 30. So we're going to conduct media outreach globally, as well as supporting your local media markets, and we can support local press releases with content and quotes as well. So again, I'll pause here for any questions about the 10 by 20 by 30 initiative itself. I know this is a lot of content, so thank you for bearing with me as we go through it. I hope it's interesting at least. Not seeing any questions, so we're just going to keep barreling right through. I think we're getting into some of the more, some of the things that in past webinars have raised questions. So I think this is some of the content that we'll start having some questions. Oh, I'm seeing someone saying something in the chat. Oh, yes, and this is just my colleague Kai. She said, remind folks that we have 90 minutes. So yes, we have a full 90 minutes. We're usually done within the hour with the presentation, and we have the rest for Q&A. So the next section, optimistically, is called Reducing Food Loss and Waste Can Be Done. So this is just going to give you a few examples of who's already making some progress and the benefits they're seeing. So this slide shows a number of companies having some very big reductions over a short period of time. So in some cases, 30 to 40 to almost 50% reductions over the matter of just a few years. And this is just a selection of some big names that have seen this. A number of companies are experiencing this sort of results after just a few years of focused attention on food loss and waste. So a few examples in greater detail. So Nestle had a reduction of by 40% in average of milk losses from transportation from farms to factories from 2017 to 2018. And so what I think is really interesting about this example is that after that 40% reduction, milk losses were reduced to 0.2% average. That's very small. So even their initial losses were only something like 0.3, 0.4%. But when you add that up over 30 countries, it equals over 10,000 tons of milk with an economic benefit of nearly 2.6 million US dollars. So the big lesson for me from this case example is that even when percentages are low, the absolute effect can still be big. Another example earlier in the supply chain is in rice losses. So the company Olam had a reduction of 36% in food loss and waste in their Cameroon operations in the rice supply chain, which ended up being about 500 tons saved per year. And what I think is interesting about this case is that the interventions they did were nothing very complicated. It was things like new bags that were less prone to breaking and were more airtight. It was things like new training for staff who were not properly handling the rice while it was being transported. So pretty simple interventions that saw big results. And so a company that I find really interesting as well is Campbell's, the US manufacturer, that has achieved a 36% reduction in the last 2 years. Just got started with this in 2017. And so this red box that's highlighted is that they define their food waste commitment in accordance with SDG 12.3. Kai will get into more of the details of what that means later on in the presentation, but just calling that out here. And so this is a summary of the sorts of things that Campbell has done throughout what's called the food recovery hierarchy. And I know this is small text in a lot of it, and I don't expect you to read it all, but what we're trying to emphasize here is that action in a number of places is what helps you achieve those results. So for example, this source reduction and reuse box or paragraph says that they used to have bread that would go to waste, and now they sell it to another company to make breadcrumbs. So something that was a waste is now a new sale and a new product. They've increased the amount of food they're redistributing to hungry people. They've moved food byproducts into animal feed to achieve that sort of energy recovery rather than it going to a landfill. So this is really just about showing that the action has to take place throughout the entire operation, and it's not going to be one silver bullet that gets you 50% of the way there in most cases. So setting the target, this is where I'm going to do a little bit of math, and I apologize for that. I hope it doesn't feel too much like university. But again, we're talking about the targets, which is an important place to start. So the request when it comes to the target is that you reduce food loss and waste within your operations by 50% by 2030. The way that we measure that is as with the indicator FLW, food loss and waste, as a percent of the product and ingredient handled by your organization. So the calculation is tons of FLW divided by all tons produced. So I think it's helpful to walk through an example of what that actually means. So the example here, the XYZ Corporation is producing 100 tons of food, and they find that 90 tons of food were sold as intended, 5 tons were donated to food banks, and 5 tons left the human food supply chain. 3 of those tons went to animal feed, and then 2 went to compost. So what that means is that the total FLW is just the 2 tons that went to compost, because the SDG target does not consider animal feed to be food waste for that purpose, for the indicator purpose. And Kai, again, we'll get into that in a little bit. But so the indicator calculation for the XYZ Corporation would therefore be 2 divided by 90 plus 5 plus 3 plus 2 for each of those items, or 2 over 100, 2%. So I know that that's probably more math than you were hoping to have to do today, but that's just an overview of what that means. So why these numbers? Why 50%? Why 2030? Well, because both of those are given to us from SDG 12.3. What base year should you use? So 2020 is preferred if you are just getting started, but if you already have solid data from an earlier year, you can use that. So in some cases, companies have already gotten started with food waste measurement and reduction, and we're not trying to penalize anyone who has already gotten started earlier. And so why this indicator? Why did we have to do that math? Well, it's because SDG 12.3 for countries is a ratio. It's talking about tons per capita. So we've adjusted that to reflect a business environment. So to keep that as a ratio, and it also helps to address questions about, if we grow, if we sell more food, if we start producing more food, then how does that impact things? And it's also it's important to capture data on an absolute basis, as we saw from that Nestle example, but progress will be tracked based on that normalized indicator, that percentage. So I'm about to hand it over to my colleague Kai to talk through some of the aspects of definitions and measurement and all that exciting stuff. But I'll pause one more time for Q&A. And I'm not seeing or hearing anything. I'll just give it a few more seconds in case someone's typing. All right. I think then I will pass it over to my colleague Kai, who will do all of the content about measurement and setting your scope of measurement. So Kai, over to you.
Thank you, Brian. I'm presuming you can hear me fine.
Yep, we can hear you nice and clear.
Always useful to check. Hello, everybody, and appreciate your joining our discussion today. As Brian mentioned, my name is Kai Robertson, and I work as the lead advisor on the Food Loss and Waste Protocol for WRI. I'm going to talk about more of the nitty-gritty now, specifically about setting your scope. For some of you on the phone, this next slide might look familiar in that it includes a photo of the Food Loss and Waste Accounting and Reporting Standard. The standard is a document I'm going to use as we go through talking about what is scope, and it's a foundational document that we produced in 2016 along with a number of other organizations. Both WRAP from the UK as well as the Consumer Goods Forum, and a number of important organizations were part of developing this, as you see from the logos on the bottom, and we also involved over 200 stakeholders across a 2-year period. And the importance of this standard is that it provides 3 things. So one is that, very importantly, it provides a common language. What is meant by food loss and waste differs, and so this standard provides that language so that we can be really clear about what has been quantified. It also provides a standardized way to summarize what you've measured. So in terms of reporting on your data and reporting on the assumptions, the standard has a short set of requirements that you would use to report your information consistently so that one can compare one inventory from to another and determine if one's comparing like to like. So again, the benefit is that the standard allows for consistency and transparency. And then as importantly, it does offer a lot of practical guidance. So if you've downloaded the standard, the full standard is a longer document because there's lots of guidance in it. There's also a very short summary, 12-page executive summary that gives you 90% of what you need to know for the first 2 bullets, the language and the reporting requirements. And there's a lot more material as well on the Food Loss and Waste Protocol website. There are case studies, there's a value calculator, there's FAQs and quantification guidance. But today we're going to focus on just one slice of all this. On the next slide, you'll see there's 10 steps here that we include in the standard. And I'm going to focus in on the one that's circled in red on establishing scope. I'll briefly talk to the others just so you have a full sense for the steps involved. The first step, not surprisingly, right, is defining your goals, because the why influences the what. And the what you quantify is the second and third step, and that's the webinar we're talking about today, the scope. After that comes how you quantify. And so the why and the what determine how you quantify. And then there's a few final steps, of course, in terms of reporting. And so as Brian mentioned, those will all be webinars that we'll be providing, and those will be available as well on the Food Loss and Waste Protocol website. And there's actually already some existing information about these on the protocol website for those of you who are anxious to get going. So I mentioned the common language. So this slide is something some of you may be familiar with who've been down this path already, but it's always really useful to step back and remember that when we're talking about food, this is a very simplified view of the food system. We've got plants, fungi, and animals. They're grown, they're raised, they're reared, and from that comes food, which is intended for people to eat, and then there's invariably some associated inedible parts, so bones, rinds, pits, peels, items that are attached to the food that's intended for people to eat but may not be considered food and part of the food supply chain. So just attached to the food, but not intended for human consumption. So anything that goes down to the left side, to food consumed, whether it's for sale or if it's redistributed through charities or through alternative secondary markets, that would be not food loss or waste because it still stays in the human food supply chain. What we're talking about here as possible food loss or waste is what leaves the food supply chain. So it's the green arrow, the red arrow, we call those material types. And that is that it's important to be specific whether you've included food and or also the inedible parts in your inventory. For many companies, they include both because it's hard to separate the two, but some companies can separate out the amounts that's food not consumed. That food not consumed and the inedible parts can go to one of 10 possible destinations. And the standard is global. We've looked across the world, and these are really the 10 places where it might go when it leaves the human food supply chain. And we'll get more into detail into all these 10 destinations, but suffice it to say this yellow-orange box is the possibility of what could be food loss or waste. And so the important point here is that if food is donated, if it stays in the human supply chain in any way, it's not considered a possible food loss or waste. And for the purposes of the standard itself is agnostic on what the definition is of food loss and waste. However, both you've heard about Champions 12.3 and this 10 by 20 by 30 initiative, they have selected a more specific description of what of these destinations are considered in scope. And we'll be talking about that in just a few minutes. So let me, again, just be clear, when we're talking about scope, I've just mentioned the material type and destinations. There's 4 components in total, with those 2 being in the middle that I've already talked to a bit, and again, I'll dive into in deeper detail. But I'm going to start now from left to right and just quickly touch on time frame, and then we'll get back to material type and destinations. So the time frame is fairly straightforward. What that means is the time frame is the period of time for which your business is reporting the food loss and waste data. And these 4 parts of scope are what are being asked that you do report on when you report on your inventory. And again, the purpose of reporting on this information is for consistency and transparency. So you want to know whether somebody has in fact reporting the data over a 12-month period, which is typical for most businesses. The measurement and reporting for the purposes of 10 by 20 by 30 really should be based on the 12 months. It could be any 12-month period, whether it's a fiscal year or a calendar year. And in some cases, if you need to extrapolate the annual figure, you can do so from data derived from a shorter time period. This might be especially true if you're operating closer to the farm. But remember to use a representative time period and to adjust for seasonality. That's very quickly on time frame. Now back to the material types. So material types, again, food is that which is intended for humans to consume. That includes beverages and drink. And the inedible parts are those components that, again, they're associated with the food, but in that particular food supply chain, so there is some subjectivity, those inedible parts are not intended to be consumed by humans. So that might be your apple's core, the stem. It could be the skin in some supply chains. In other supply chains, the skin is eaten. So again, what is considered inedible varies by culture and by the particular supply chain. And the distinction doesn't matter necessarily so much if you report on both food and inedible parts. But if you are separating out the inedible parts, then it's much more important to be clear on what parts you've excluded from your inventory. I want to share this disgusting picture of banana, because it makes the point that there's just a need to be clear when we use the terms inedible or edible, because they can refer to different things. So inedible parts are not the same as inedible food. This banana is considered food that's no longer edible. Some might say it's inedible. And as in it was intended for someone to eat, but it's no longer fit for consumption. That's not the same as the inedible part of the banana peel. So again, inedible parts inedible food is not the same as inedible parts. The inedible part is the bones or the rinds, pits or stones, and again, that's not intended for consumption. So just be careful with the language if you use the terms related to edibility. And there's also additional guidance on how to separate inedible parts if that's important to your business that RAP has developed in their produce guidance. So to sum up material types, basically any plants are in scope, any part of the animal is in scope. What is not in scope is any mud or stones that might be attached to your product, like potatoes. We recognize that estimates might need to be made to remove some of these amounts. Similarly, with any water added, that is not considered a material type and should be excluded, as well as any plant material, so something like the straw you see here. Moving from material types to destinations, a bit more about what is meant by destinations. So that is, again, where the food loss and waste, either the food and or the inedible parts, goes when it's removed from the human food supply chain and does not get consumed by people. These destinations are in alphabetical order, and we realize not all destinations are created equal. Some certainly have higher associated impacts than others, some provide more value. But these are, again, are the 10 possibilities. And when looking at destinations, it's important to think about the fact that this represents where the food and or inedible parts goes when it leaves the human food supply chain. It's not about the output at the end of the destination, but really the first step of the destination. So I'll discuss that a bit more in this next slide when talking briefly about the definitions of some of these destinations in particular. So I'll start at the top here with animal feed and bio-based material and biochemical processing. As you heard Brian allude to this, and as you saw in the Campbell's example, for the purposes of 10 by 20 by 30, animal feed and bio-based material, biochemical processing are not considered food waste. So they're, for the purposes, again, of meeting SDG 12.3, they are excluded from what's to be cut by 50%. I'll dive into that more later to really make sure that's crystal clear. But first, in terms of understanding what's animal feed, that is any material that's diverted from the food supply chain, either directly or after processing to animals. So that could be material that goes to pet feed, pet food. It could be going to zoo animals. It could be going to make animal feed that's fed to livestock. The second category is the bio-based material, biochemical processing. That's for many businesses in the food processing sector, that would be considered rendering. It is basically converting material into an industrial product. And the important comment here that I get a lot of questions about is, well, so if we're using rendering to create biodiesel, does that fall into this category? And the answer is yes. But if you are using the biogas from, say, anaerobic digestion processes, then that actually falls in the next destination, which is listed here as co-digestion, anaerobic digestion, because as I mentioned, where the product first goes is the destination that you'd use. So if you're sending materials into anaerobic digestion, at the end, take off the biogas for your facility or for otherwise, it's the destination is still considered anaerobic digestion. Now, the next slide here is let me go back one, Brian, to the suggested 10 by 20 by 30 interpretation. So I've mentioned the material types. For the interpretation of 10 by 20 by 30, the 50% reduction target applies to both food and associated inedible parts. And it excludes the animal feed and the bio-based material biochemical processing. Let me elaborate on that a bit more as to the rationale. In terms of both food and inedible parts being in scope, this interpretation is one that the FAO as well as the European Commission has also adopted. And it applies to both material types because Target 12.3 comes under SDG 12. And SDG 12 is about sustainable consumption and production. It's not so in the end, this reduction of food loss and waste is about food security, of course, but also as much about resource use efficiency. And so we want to look at both material types. That said, there's an important note on the bottom of the slide, on the bottom right, where which allows for if you can measure the amount of food separately from the associated inedible parts. In some businesses that's possible, in others it's not. but you could apply the 50% reduction target only to the food portion that leaves the food supply chain. And then this flexibility recognizes that for some entities, that a significant share of the food loss waste might be those associated inedible parts, whether it's bones, feathers, other byproducts. And therefore, if leaving inedible parts out of your 50% reduction target is possible, we recognize having the amount of inedible parts can be much more difficult to achieve. So you can just focus on having the amount of food. Further, I guess I'll spend a bit more time on this slide. So I do want to talk a bit more now about these destinations. So the consensus is that what's a food loss or waste covers the 8 possible destinations you see checked here. So it does exclude animal feed and the bio-based materials destinations for a few reasons. And one of the primary reasons for excluding these destinations is, again, that using inedible parts to make animal feed or for other non-food industrial products is, in many cases, the most efficient use and highest value use of those materials. But again, to be clear, right, where food goes to those 2 destinations, if food is going to animal feed, if food is going to biomaterial processing, for the purposes of SDG 12.3, that is not counted as part of the 50% reduction target. However, we still don't want food going to those destinations if it could be feeding people. So the important point to note here is that there's a recommendation that to nonetheless track the amounts going to those destinations, because in your particular business, there may certainly be a big opportunity to save food from going there and recapturing the lost revenue. And so 2 other quick comments on this slide. One is that, as I mentioned, this recommendation is consistent with what's the approach proposed by FAO and the European Commission for country-level reporting. So if you follow the work of those organizations closely, you'll see this does line up. There is a little asterisk there in terms of the destination called not harvested. In short, the destination of not harvested is in scope for the 10 by 20 by 30 initiative. It is a destination that the European Commission and FAO is making optional because there is not as much data at the country level on the amounts not harvested. But it's really important. It's a really important destination because there's the data shows that there's quite a lot of potential food that's left at harvest or plowed in the field for many reasons that may be, due to Mother Nature and beyond a company's control, but it's still nonetheless important to really track that amount and understand it better. And then I want to just comment on one destination where we get a lot of questions, and so that would be compost in particular. And in some cases, AD, anaerobic digestion as well. That is a higher value destination, and there's value in placing food there or inedible parts if there is no other alternative. But it is a destination. The amount that's going to any of these 8 destinations is what we want to cut in half. And as important as something like compost is, if you want to generate a soil amendment, or if you, for the purposes of AD, if you want to generate energy, there's a much more efficient way to do so than growing a bunch of food and incurring all the energy and all the other resources and costs of transporting it, processing it, et cetera, and then burning it or composting it. So again, important categories, but they are part of the 8 destinations to cut in half. And you'll see that on this next slide. So talking a bit more about how do we get to the 50% reduction target. The 8 destinations you see are surrounded by a red box here, and this is the waste stream to be reduced by 50%. So you basically are moving material out of the red and orange boxes. The way you do that can be by taking multiple different steps. So the green arrow on the top is the first priority, which is leaving food in the food supply chain and feeding people. So whether it's maximizing the ability to donate and rescue the food or finding ways to sell it, that's where we want to first focus. And you'll see on the next slide, we have quick guidance based on the colors of the boxes on how do you reach the reduction target. Basically, again, you move material out of the red and orange destinations. Number 1, you first try to keep food from leaving the food supply chain. So you take the red, orange, anything that goes to the red and orange boxes, and there will be a little orange arrow appearing here that shows you to move it. You want to move it to dark green. So red, orange to dark green is what you try to do first. If that's not possible, then the next option is to move what's in the red and orange boxes now into what's in the light green boxes. That would be moving it to animal feed or to the bio-based material and processing. And then we have, as a final slide here, a quick summary, real simplified, no text, of how you achieve the 50% reduction to those 8 destinations that we're talking about and support SDG target 12.3. I'm going to switch now to the final box on the 4 scope components, which is boundary. The boundary is composed of a couple other things here that make it clear what you've included in your inventory. The recommendation for 10 by 20 by 30 is to report against your direct operations, so that which is owned by your company. In terms of the food category, this would include all food categories relevant to your direct operations. For the life cycle stage, that is your direct operations. For some businesses that here's some additional detail on what that might include, right? It's the sites operated by your company. It could be the food rejects owned by your company. If there's any transport of owned product, that's in scope. What's not in scope is the food loss and waste generated at any of your upstream supplier sites or any other stages in the supply chain. Those are important to quantify. It's important to start to think outside your own operations. But for the purpose of this, of 10 by 20 by 30, the scope is your direct operation. From a geographic perspective, this should include all the geographies relevant to your direct operations. And from an organization perspective, that box is important in that it helps to provide context. So here you would report the organizational units within which the reported FLW occurs. So the ideas include the type and number of facilities. So if you've got 100 facilities, 90 of them manufacturing, 10 of them distribution centers, that gives important context to your inventory. And as well, if for some reason it's just not possible to report FLW from a certain part of your operations, then at least initially, we would encourage, this is where you state any exclusions. The exclusions are really important to state, because if you had to make some exceptions, then it's really important to know what's in the baseline and what's not in the baseline. So that's the boundary. Those were the 4 parts of scope. And there are, of course, a few related issues, so I'll just briefly mention on these. These are questions that come up quite a lot. But packaging, of course, product is often put into packaging, but that's not food loss or waste. So the standard requires that you exclude the weight of any packaging. In some cases, where you've got yogurt in a container, that might be difficult to remove the packaging. So there is a lot of guidance on the protocol website and in the standard itself about how you might go about estimating the weight of packaging. Similarly, for water added or removed, if you've added any water for cleaning or to meet regulatory requirements for diluting the FLW before disposal, you want to exclude that amount of the water, because you're reporting on the FLW when it was generated before you added any water. Or if you dehydrated the food loss and waste, again, you want to report on the weight before any water weight was reduced. And the last point, for those of you who are measuring closer to agricultural production, the standard starts at the point a product is ready for harvest or slaughter. So anything that's pre-harvest and a loss beforehand it's important to understand what happens before harvest, but those amounts are not to be included in the inventory. But you can, of course, track those amounts separately if that's useful, and we can get more into that if people have questions, and there's related guidance in the standard. So I'm going to share a few examples. As Brian mentioned, Tesco's been working with some of its suppliers for a couple of years, and I want to show here an example from G's Fresh Food, who's in the fresh vegetables and salads business, how they visually use these parts of scope to describe what they've included in their inventory. And so you see they have the time frame listed, material type for their purposes is food. And really the most important one I wanted to comment on here on this slide is in the destinations, you'll see the 8 destinations are in scope, but there are 2 different colored arrows. And the reason for that is because you want to be clear what we've considered as your scope, but there may not be material going to all of them. So the yellow, what is again, just to give an example, this is what GEES has produced publicly in a case study that Tesco has put out on its website. So the source, and where you can see a number of case studies, is the website on the bottom of this slide. In GEES case, you can see by looking at the second and the fourth circle that this is their waste by destination from one year to the next. And that's recommended to report by destination where that data exists. They've also reported waste by category in the first and the third circles. And they are, in the yellow box here, you'll see that they've been successful in 1 year to reduce the FLW as a percentage of production from 14.5% to 11.3%, which is a 22% reduction. And again, just an example to show you how the data has been shared by one company. I'm going to share a second example, simply in the spirit of showing that, as you see, GEES has data going to food loss and waste going to lots of destinations. This is another company called Cranswick, large meat producer in the UK. And all of their FLW goes to just one destination of anaerobic digestion, as you see here. Again, that's not to say that they don't have a lot going to animal feed and bio-based material and processing. That is reported by them in the Food Waste Atlas, which is a reporting platform that will be used for 10 by 20 by 30. But for the purposes of the 50% reduction target, it's the anaerobic digestion that's in scope. You can see their food waste as a percent of production, again, using the definition of those 8 destinations is 0.85% of their production. And in 1 year, they too were able to make a 20% reduction in FLW. So as Brian mentioned earlier, reductions are possible, and it's exciting to see this progress. So I'm going to 2 more slides from my end. This slide is a summary recommendation of what to measure and report for 10 by 20 by 30. And you've heard us reference parts of this already. So to sum it up, the ask for 10 by 20 by 30 is to report on these 4 items: the overall tonnage, the absolute weight of the FLW, and again, the FLW in this case being those what goes to those 8 destinations. The tons of the FLW as a percent of the tons produced, and there's an asterisk to be clear about what's in the bottom of that denominator. Brian talked through an example of it. The FLW amount by destination, it's important to understand what's going where. And then separately, it's a strong recommendation to also report separate from the FLW, the amount of surplus food that's redistributed to charities or other organizations, as well as to understand the amounts going to animal feed and or biomaterial biochemical processing, because there's certainly still opportunity there, even if those destinations are not part of the 50% reduction target. And then we ask that you clearly define a report using the standard, the scope that we've been talking about for your own operations, and then also the methods and assumptions. And we'll talk more about methods and assumptions in a future webinar. Best practice optional is to report the FLW tonnage by product categories as well, as you saw in the 2 prior case examples. It helps know what categories are contributing the most or the least to the food loss and waste, and then any details of assurance undertaken as will help enhance the confidence in your quantification and to understand the nature of the quality of the data. My last slide is to just share a screenshot from the Food Loss and Waste Protocol website, where you can find the executive summary. That is, again, a short 12-pager. If you haven't read that yet, that's the main document to read. It's available in different languages. And there's also, when you go through the standard FLW standard tab, you'll see there's the ability to access case studies, tools and resources, other prior trainings, FAQs, and as well get to the food waste file list directly. With that, I will turn the presentation back to Brian. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kai. We'll pause again for Q&A. I'll just give a couple of comments quickly. One is that I know that seemed like a lot, and if you are still sort of formulating thoughts in your head and formulating questions, please feel free to reach out to us after this presentation. We're available and happy to answer your questions. The other I would just say is that although some of this may seem daunting, a lot of companies are already collecting this data for other purposes. And so it's just about finding that data that's already out there in some cases and then repurposing it for this use. So just a couple of things to make it maybe a little less, hopefully it doesn't feel overwhelming, but if it does, those are a couple of things that show that it's achievable and that there are plenty of companies already doing it. So any questions, feel free to type them into the chat or just unmute your microphone and ask. I'm not seeing anything. So we'll just give it about 30 more seconds in case someone's typing something out right now. And if there's nothing, I'll just do a couple concluding slides and give you back the extra time. All right, well, I'm not seeing anything, so there's still a couple more minutes if you have any thoughts. But what I'll show you, just to conclude, is what we're going to share when we're sharing the slides and everything is also a customizable template to graphically show the scope of your own standard, your own inventory. So again, using a template based on that recommended scope that Kai talked through. These are the slides that you'll receive. This is just a sort of instructional slide here. And what this will help you do is, so here's that suggested 10 by 20 by 30 interpretation again. And what the template will allow you to do is now here on this busier slide. So the red text are things you would change. The green check marks are what you would put next to in terms of what material types and destinations are in scope. And then that sort of pinkish check mark would be for destinations that are in scope, but you don't have any FLW going to that destination. So for example, if you're not in the farm level or production level operations, you probably won't have anything that counts as not harvested or going to land application, for example. So we'll be sharing this. And again, this is something that we would ask that you just do a little bit of homework in terms of taking a stab at filling this out for your company. It doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to get it 100% right the first time. And it's something that we are more than happy to help with and ask questions with, answer questions as well. So this will be part of the materials that will be sent out once these introductory webinars have concluded. Okay, so I'm not seeing any other questions or comments in the chat. So I think we can just finish up the webinar about 20-25 minutes early. So thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. We're so excited to be on board with this with you. As I said, please do not hesitate for 1 second to reach out to us if you have any questions, comments, concerns. We're happy to address them and to speak with you. So thank you all for joining, and I look forward to working together with you and joining you in the next discussions. So thank you and have a great rest of your day.